Good afternoon or hello, I guess, depending on where you're joining us today. A massive thanks to Elisabeth, Alan and Gwyneth, who are joining us for this parallel session, which is on assessment innovation in a time of disruption. Today's the second day of RIDE, so it's the assessment themed day. So quite rightly, we have three speakers who are going to share some of their experiences with us this afternoon. Just a few ground rules for us to all know what's happening. So each presenter is going to have 20 minutes and I will interrupt not too rudely at about the 2-minute left mark, and then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A. So if you are in the audience, please do put your questions in through the Q&A button just at the bottom of your screen, or feel free to use the chat. If you are using the chat, if you can put it to either the panelist or panelists and attendees, then we can make sure that there's a multi-way dialogue happening for all concerned. And if there's any time left, we'll do a little bit more of this engaging discussion on this really pertinent aspect of, I think, all of our teaching and learning lives at the moment. So our first speaker today is Elisabeth Hill. She will be taking us through disrupting the assessment of performance in the creative disciplines, lessons learned from COVID. Elisabeth, you have 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's great to be here, and I'm going to focus very much today on performance in creative disciplines. I'm based at Goldsmiths, University of London. We have a whole range of disciplines being taught at Goldsmiths, but we have a particular kind of focus on creative disciplines. So I'm going to actually talk a lot about our theatre and performance assessments, but the same principles that I'm talking about in terms of theatre and performance apply in all sorts of our other departments, including music, design, art, and so on. So theatre and performance is a department which hosts a range of programmes. Again, the principles of the assessment work that I'm going to share with you apply across those programmes, although I'm focusing on an assessment approach that sits within our BA Drama and Theatre Arts, which is very much a kind of critical, sort of radical innovation type programme. I'm using this as an example because I think it brings to life the sorts of approaches that we've taken to move performance online during COVID. So what would normally happen in this programme for our third-year undergraduates is that effectively they work collaboratively through the programme, and in the final year they create these small theatre companies, and their final project or their final performance is the outcome of a process of the exploration of ideas that they have worked on through the year in those small theatre companies that they've created. That work is critically informed, and it's a research-led making process, so it's very engaged and collaborative and usually face-to-face throughout the whole year. There's then a live final show, which is part of a festival that the whole cohort curates. And obviously in the good old days, that work was predominantly performed in our George Wood Theatre. Some aspects of it were performed in the theatre studios, and occasionally sort of on location in other places or outside. But of course, March 2020, lockdown 1.0 happened and group performance couldn't happen. The university was closed and all of the group work had to be done from individual students' homes, bedrooms, and so on. Students were scattered all over the place, and although they'd started the collaborative work for their performances, obviously they went from being able to do that in person to being on their own in their bedroom and working through mobile phones and laptops and so on. They performed all of their work online that last year, but then in the course of this year, 2020, 2021, obviously we've been in and out of lockdown, And so what I want to do is show you some examples of the sort of assessment work the students have produced this year as a way of illustrating some of the ways that you can assess creative practice and particularly performance when you're in this kind of flux situation and when you essentially have to rely on digital means. So our students were working in person and online. We're in London. Some students were in London living on the campus. Others were living in other parts of London, in the UK and overseas. And in parts of the year, there were opportunities for them to come together and collaborate in a socially distanced way. But actually, not all of the students were able to be on campus, even in those situations. So even then, it was a mix of work. So in theory, students were working in a whole range of locations, and they were using a whole range of different media. And part of the work that we had to do to help move assessment online or have this blended approach to assessment was to provide new and very tailored sort of digitally driven technical support for the students in order that they could produce high quality work from their own homes. And what this kind of ended up in is a curated festival. Instead of being in person wholly, this has digital output, and it's the Tap Out Festival, which has a whole range of small theatre companies kind of contributing to it. All the third year students were involved. Now, there were kind of three types of work and assessment that kind of fell out of this year. Now, I'm going to show you examples. So the first kind of set of pieces of work were pieces of work that were developed online and in person in these small groups, and they were performed sort of like normal in our George Wood Theatre with a very small audience, and these were recorded and then they were shared so that the broad audience, the usual large audience, could kind of participate and view the work. Now, not everybody in the groups would be able to collaborate in person. So there's a real digital component to this anyway. But if this video works, I want to give you a kind of sense of what that looks like so that you can just see. You won't, I don't think, be able to hear, but that doesn't matter because the point here is really to get a sense of what the show looks like with the audience. I think that will start. No, it's not working brilliantly, but basically what you've got here, and I'll show you in a still, is essentially you've got an audience, you've got a screen, and you've got a couple of performers. Now, this screen enables those members of the group who are not able to be part of the physical performance or the live performance to be part of that performance, and it's integrated into the work that the students have created. Do you have a live audience? Very, very similar in that respect to what it would have been like a couple of years before. Second set of work is work that was collaborated on, produced and performed entirely digitally. So this is work where students who are sort of based in different locations or countries potentially could be coming together, and they were doing digital collaboration and digital production. So these are where their physical performances were created and performed in domestic spaces, whilst they were isolated and in different countries. And this required, in order for this kind of assessment to work, this required another kind of form of slightly altered technical support for students around how to do scenography, what kind of platforms to use to create your work when you're working in your single bedroom or your kitchen or whatever. So these were obviously digital performances that were shared entirely online. So here are some stills of the kind of work that was produced. Now this is, so in this piece of work, you effectively have two personalities. One is kind of a depressed personality, and one is a much more kind of happy, measured personality during the period of the filming. And this is kind of illustrated by the colouring of the videos. There's really different kinds of music that's illustrated, but what the students have done is they've been able to kind of set things up so that the background and the activities that they're performing in their video are the same. And at times you see a split screen. So I don't know how well that will come out on this bottom right image, but you can see the two students and you can see they're actually drawing, but you can see the kind of grey filter and the colour to illustrate some of the differences. And this work is split up through titles. There's a soundtrack and there's a narrative which is captured in 2 languages, and in fact occasionally 3 as you go through. And then finally, the sort of third type of assessment that students developed was what we might call installation work. So this is recorded work. It's been recorded live. It was usually performed in the studios that we have. So it was developed online, produced in a studio, and shared live and for later viewing on the digital platform. And here again, further types of enhanced sonography support, both on site and in relation to the production of the work. So to give you an example of what this looks like from the video stills, sorry, you can see there's an individual student in this case due to the space size, and their work kind of moves through a set of trajectories and concludes with a final board. This is accompanied by a soundtrack, but no speech at all. So we kind of see that through this work, although students actually were doing the same assessment, they had the same remit, the same learning outcomes, the same detailed and individualized support from our academic team and our specialist technical team. The students were doing the same sorts of work, but they were having to use very different ways of creating that work, collaborating together and producing it in order that the assessment could be achieved. Students were actually very positive. They were obviously nervous about the change, and there are many things about the change that were disappointing for them and concerned them. But in fact, having gone through the assessment, students were positive about some of the opportunities that gave them, some of the innovation opportunities that gave them, and actually thinking about creating different sorts of work through different media and in different ways was something that they found enjoyable, they're positive about, and they're keen that we incorporate into future opportunities for students as and when we get back to a situation where it wouldn't need to be done in this way. So was this a big change? A lot remains the same when you break it down. And what actually students and staff have had to do is adapt to the COVID context, be responsive to it, and think about managing and supporting students who are in very different personal situations and locations. So that's been a huge kind of amount of work and change to thinking for staff, academic staff, technical teams, and they've had to really think about how they might need to inspire, challenge, support, guide, question, and facilitate students' learning in slightly different ways to the ways that they had been used to when students were all working together on campus in the same physical spaces together with the staff team as well. Students have continued to work together. They've found innovative ways and creative ways to do that when they've all been in so many different locations and had different personal challenges and experiences to kind of adapt to. And they have been still able to curate their festival and sort of create an audience in slightly different ways to the ones they had perhaps expected when they enrolled on our course, but nonetheless, that has been very successful. There have been some positives actually that I think we would want to retain, which include actually almost the accessibility of the opportunity for particular audiences to watch the work at its kind of first showing. So that digital opportunity, which is normally curated and published after the event, actually was a live launch. So relatives of students scattered around the world were actually more able to watch the big reveal than they would have been in the past. And that's been very appealing for some people. The themes in the work the students produce will inevitably reflect their personal experiences and their and their cohort's concerns about their lives and the world and the global challenges in any year. And that's particularly clear in the work of the last couple of years. We see a lot of assessed work around isolation and the sorts of issues and challenges and inequalities that COVID has brought. So that's not a big change. It changes the focus of what the students are producing and what we are looking at when we assess, but it's not a big change in terms of a kind of underlying principle. And actually, we've seen even more creativity and even more resilience through the assessed work than we would even normally see. So I think one of the things that we've learned is that whatever the situation and whatever the context, performance artists do find a way through a variety of media to address and express the conditions of the times as works of art, and in this case, as performances. So what does that mean for the future? I think it means that we will move to a new normal rather than the old normal. I think originally staff and students were expecting that we would have a year or two of this kind of work and this kind of assessment, and then we would slot back to a kind of on-campus only model. And whilst we will be encouraging our students to work together in person, what this has shown is there are also other ways in which digital can support and enhance the work and the assessment of it. We see digital assessment as a way of expanding opportunities, innovation and creativity, not taking away from the in-person opportunities, but being an additional part of the toolbox that will now be open to students, and which we now have more expertise in thinking about and delivering and supporting students in these kinds of assessments. And I think we also kind of can articulate much better the importance and impact of performance and creative practices in the world in general. And that's kind of illustrated through many of the assessment, or much of the assessment work that we've seen and we've supported to be delivered by students. Students have produced themselves. But actually, I think this is a really important component of what online assessment can show us, or what reflecting on that assessment can show us, particularly against the backdrop where creative practice is in many ways being battered at university level by the government and financial impacts and so on. So I think these assessments show us the importance and the impact of these practices for the whole of society, and that's a really positive additional benefit of having these digital experiences. So that sort of draws to an end. If you want to have a look at the performances that I've been talking about, I can post the link in chat. That's an open website if you want to kind of browse around and see the different kinds of ways that the students have used digital opportunities to produce their work. And I should acknowledge the work and the support of our Department of Theatre and Performance in putting together the assessments and the adaptations and supporting the students to produce such high quality work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for that. And I didn't even need to give you a 2-minute warning. Perfect on time. Just a really a fantastic sort of sharing of that some might say overlooked sort of area in terms of, you know, trying to make sure that assessment is still fulfilled even under really pressured and challenging times for everyone. So I think we actually have a question in the Q&A sections, which Elisabeth, I wonder if you might want to answer live. I think some of it may have been addressed already during your presentation, but they've said, congratulations, really amazing work. How is digital literacy and access addressed for this cohort? Did you need to support them with additional tools or guidance?
A really good question, really important. So we did. So we had a couple of things. There's probably 2 or 3 things to kind of talk about. So we had, we used funds, or we opened up student hardship type funds for digital access for online learning and assessment. So there was a scheme that students who needed certain types of equipment could apply for. That was mostly about basic equipment. But so what the key things were that in the first year, so last academic year, 1920, we had, as a kind of sector, certain license agreements that were made with certain software companies to give students access to software that would usually only be accessible on campus. So that was really helpful for the previous academic year. That wasn't so much possible this academic year. But part of what happened this academic year is that we were much more planned. We planned for what was going to happen. There was some times when students were more likely to be face-to-face on campus with their staff, and times when they wouldn't be. So we used those face-to-face times for those that could be on campus to kind of ensure they had access to things they needed. We also provided the tech teams, the technical teams particularly, provided a lot of guidance, kind of worksheets, talking through with students the sorts of resources that were available to them, particularly free or via the university, so that they could be set up and supported to learn things that they hadn't learned because no one would have ever expected to have needed to know those things. So it's a variety of financial but more kind of guidance and tailored support depending on what the students group was focusing on.
Okay. Thanks, Elisabeth, for that. I was just sort of taken with the, you know, with many that have had to do the pivot and therefore provide this extra layer of support, either technical or a little bit of financial or physical machines to borrow, etc. And it strikes me that, you know, you mentioned that the learning outcomes were still met, still achieved, and there are probably a few more learning outcomes that have been achieved through the upskilling, if you like, with the tools and things. Do you think the students sort of recognise the value of what they've now achieved having gone through this?
I think so. So it's a good question, because I think there's, you know, people talk a lot about the things that students have lost, and of course students have lost a lot of experiences that they expected to have and we expected to give them. But on the other hand, we've all learned a lot of things we didn't expect to learn. So I think there is a balance. I think actually students who have been working in the creative practice, who work closely with one another and closely with staff teams in that really reflexive and iterative way, are probably, I don't know if this is the case, but my sense is that they are probably more aware of what they've gained and how they might use it than perhaps students whose subjects and disciplines lead them to work a bit more in isolation from one another and their tutors as the natural course of it. So I think, yeah, I think people will realise with hindsight as well a lot more than in the moment. But I think this year's students are much more aware of that than last year's.
Thank you. I think there's someone who's itching to grab those website links to the students' work. So I think we'll share those in the chat.
I'll do that now.
I think we will probably follow up. Alan, you have a question?
I do have a question. I thought it was a really fascinating presentation. And the thing, it's an observation rather than a question. It seems to me that the learning from that isn't restricted at all to theatre and drama studies. The way in which assessment was rethought and reconceptualized and delivered with digital support strikes me as very relevant to so many fields in higher education. So that's the thing that struck me was, my goodness, how does this learning get outside theatre studies into other discipline areas?
So it's a really good point, and I could have talked focused on our music department and the way they did their performances, particularly the popular music performances, which are a little bit harder at times to kind of move online, mostly because of equipment needs. But you know, similarly with our design or our media department or our art department, a number of departments. Actually, once you start kind of drilling into what they did, I think the theatre and performance is a good example, and it has nice videos that I could share with you because of the timing of their show, their festival. But yes, I mean, our music department, they did a range of things. They brought students who could come onto campus and who wanted to on campus. We opened up campus last summer only for those students for a little while, and there were obviously quite a lot of constraints. They had to put on equipment. They loaned students equipment. The way they got equipment to students was really innovative. For students who were living abroad, who were unable to access equipment, or who we had no insurance to allow them to have the equipment because of location, they worked again on exploring different ways of delivering what the student was wanting to do in their assessment. So I think staff have been really innovative themselves and very responsive to finding ways or supporting students to find new ways to do things. So I think a lot of new ways of working and new ways of performing in any discipline have kind of come out of the way that work is developed and constructed in a kind of university creative performing context.
Definitely. We have another live question for you, Elisabeth. So the impact on educators in restructuring the assessment must have been considerable. How was that managed?
Also a good question, because staff were as sort of new to all of this as students, and in terms of kind of familiarity and confidence with some of the digital solutions, there were situations where students were more familiar or confident than staff at the outset. So I think, I mean, there are a few ways in which we've managed this. I think staff have individually, you know, thrown themselves even more into supporting the students. As an institution, one of the things that we were very clear about with our heads of department was that we expected that other things would have to slow down or stop for a while. And that was a natural kind of consequence of people having to spend more time thinking about assessments, thinking about delivery, creating new guides, liaising with students and so on. So I think that's a really important component, because you know, everybody is balancing huge workloads. Everybody was balancing everything about COVID and all the worries and practicalities and all of these kind of things in the same way as the students. And so we felt it was really important to say, as an institution, our key priority is for our students to continue and graduate at the time that they expected, as much as is possible. And that's our priority. And research and other factors, they are important, but we recognize, you know, some of those things may need to give, because students and their progress is our ultimate priority here. So that's really the sort of broad institutional way we managed it. And then within departments, just amazing staff working with amazing students and being really resourceful.
Wonderful, thank you, Elisabeth, for that. We have maybe a couple of minutes left for any specific questions for this one. Just checking through to see if there are any more. I think we're good. So thank you so much, Elisabeth, for the really tangible, just really nice live experience that you've been able to share with very practical implications for, you know, institutions that may have been a little slower to implement the radical change, but you know, a very positive outcome that's clearly impacted your staff, but also for the students' benefits as well, which I think, you know, that's what we're sort of in it for, isn't it? Thank you so much for that. So now moving to our next presentation, we have sorry, there's just a comment for you, Elisabeth, in the chat from Prachi there, appreciating your experience as well. So we're moving to our second presentation this afternoon. So this one is from Gwyneth Hughes from UCL IOE and Alan Tate from OU, and both of them are CD fellows. So the title of their presentation is Has the Pandemic Triggered a Radical Rethink of Assessment? So obviously this assessment theme is very strong, and here hopefully Alan and Gwyneth are likely to take us through some very tangible examples as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynsie, and just a little prod, Alan, to unmute. I'm Gwyneth Hughes, and I'm a reader in higher education at the Institute of Education, and I'm particularly interested in assessment and pedagogy. I've done quite a lot of research on ipsative assessment, which is about assessment and progress, measuring students' progress. And the talk that we're going to give, I think, follows on very well from Linda and Stylianos and Alan's keynote, and perhaps Alan will say a bit more about that. And I'll try and get the slides on the screen. Okay, over to you, Alan.
Okay, so I'm Alan Tate, CDE fellow at the Centre for Distance Education at the University of London, and an emeritus professor in distance education and development at the Open University. So let me introduce this report on this project, which Gwyneth and I have led. The title, Has the Pandemic Triggered a Radical Rethink of the Purposes of Assessment, could have grown out of that keynote, which some of you will have listened to at the beginning of this afternoon. And indeed, Gwyneth and I did work very closely with Stylianos Hatzipanagos in particular. But the chronology is the other way around. So actually, our project began before that examination of how the University of London managed its online examinations in 2020. Because Gwyneth and I conceived this project back in 2019 because the University of London wanted to find out what changes were taking place across a range of different programs and a range of different universities indeed, because the University of London itself delivers programs, but it also acts as the delivery vehicle for a range of universities within the University of London network. And the extent to which, the core question really, which we were trying to get at, was the extent to which assessment was moving away from primarily judging performance or only judging performance to also supporting learning. So Gwyneth, I think you're driving the slides. Yes, thank you. So let me just give you a bit of context for how this investigation began. So the University of London has an extraordinarily long record in examining. In fact, you could say it really was a machine built for examinations from 1858, when it did something very radical indeed. It opened the possibility of study more or less all around the world to people saying, we'll send you a curriculum, we'll set you an examination at the end, you can get support from some local help if you can, or you can work completely independently. So they made study available in a way that was quite radical, because they divorced it from place. They said it doesn't matter, you don't have to live in London to be a student of the University of London. And they also, I think, also very importantly, opened this university study to women far ahead of the rest of the university sector in the UK. So the University of London was built an examination system where people sat unseen examinations in exam halls in the classic way, all around the world. And by 2020, there are more than 50,000 students in 202 countries, quite an extraordinary span of international students. And the way in which assessment was organized was primarily through end of course and end of year examinations. But in 2017, the University of London wanted to encourage colleagues, in particular program directors, to start rethinking assessment. And it produced something called an assessment toolkit. And the aspiration here was to move assessment away from this historic model of the examination, the unseen examination in an exam hall, to not to move away from it entirely, but to include other modes of assessment, in particular, to encourage the use of assessment to support learning, as well as judging performance. So that was a sort of context in which Gwyneth and I conceived this project. Next slide, Gwyneth. So our project back in 2019 was to review what innovation we could find in assessment practice in the University of London over the previous 2 years. And we were going to do this primarily through interviews with programme directors to get their assessment of how their understanding of assessment was changing and how that might have impacted on the particular assessment activities which they had brought in. But that, of course, was simply pushed aside by the COVID pandemic when the University of London had to suddenly move all its examinations online. So 160 years of history was suddenly radically changed. And so I'm going to hand over to Gwyneth now to take you through what we actually did.
Well, actually, I'm going to just say a little bit more about the purposes of assessment before discussing the results. And just say a little bit more about exams, which have been this gold standard of assessment, the unseen, invigilated, in-person timed exam. And this is very much, the purpose is very much about testing, measuring attainment, reliability, getting qualifications. And there's often very little emphasis on feedback for students. It's not about a learning experience, it's about testing. And as we've seen in the earlier keynote, that can be replicated online using technology, using proctoring. But the alternative view of assessment is very much about students learning from assessment and what students can learn from assessment. And this is sometimes called assessment for learning, AFL. And there are many ways in which students are learning from assessment. And the most obvious way is from feedback, which, as I said, any exams can have feedback, but of course it has to be effective. It has to be feedback that students can apply to a future activity or assessment. Students can also learn from assessments in the preparation of the assessment, and this particularly is evident when students have to do coursework or a student presentation, because they have to obviously research their coursework, research their presentation, and obviously preparing for exams as well is encouraging students to learn. But if the exams are very much about facts and memorising, then it's a different learning experience from, say, an open book exam that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. An open book exam where students can actually access the internet, look at other sources, maybe look at notes. Far less about memorising. It's much more about synthesising, bringing together information and thinking and creating, much more creative. So what I'm saying really is that exams, there can be learning there, but perhaps open book exams are going to provide more opportunities. And then the final way students can learn from exams is actually, from assessment, is by actually taking part in the assessment process. So they understand how we do the assessment, what the criteria are, what the standards are. And one way of doing that is to involve students in peer marking and feedback. So those are the kind of things that are in this toolkit that Alan was talking about. And so what we did is we interviewed these 13 programme directors from a range of disciplines, and we had undergraduate programmes, postgraduate, and even pre-university courses. And it's quite good doing the online interviewing. We used Zoom and Skype because you get automatic transcripts. So that's another benefit to come out of doing the research online. And we asked them, our initial question was to ask them about what they had changed to their assessment and why in the past 3 years. And the answer to that was they hadn't really done much change in the previous 3 years until the COVID pivot to online exams occurred. And then they were all talking about many changes to assessment. We also asked them about the the toolkit, whether they used the toolkit, and found that although they did mention the toolkit, obviously they had some use. They said they heard of it, it was useful. We didn't really get a sense that it had been really very necessary, very helpful for this enormous switch to online exams. I'm not going to give you lots of quotation. We had lots of very rich materials, but two of the interesting things that were repeatedly said by not all, but by several program directors. The first one was about this having to rewrite the exam questions for an open book exam, because realizing that they couldn't have any questions that required straight recall, giving a definition, for example, that they could just copy and paste from online sources. So they had to think about the question, so that students, in this first quote, had to synthesize information across many different areas and produce more of a personal reflection. So they had to think, basically, and they also felt that the issue about fraud, i.e. maybe plagiarism or cheating, wouldn't be so strong in these kind of assessments, because it's very much about the individual students' ideas and thinking. The students are being creative, having to produce something new, rather than sort of repeat what's already in their coursework books. So that was very interesting. The other interesting thing that came up was the fact that students were having more time for their exams. And this also gave students an opportunity for learning. In this second quote, and this was from a mathematics course, that students were obviously crossing things out, making mistakes, learning from it during the actual exam. And because they got a bit of extra time, sometimes, as Linda said in the keynote, they might just have an extra hour to allow for downloading and uploading, or they might be given 24 hours or 48 hours to do the exam. So giving that more time not only takes the pressure off and the stress, which, you know, obviously we would think would be beneficial, but it also means that they could correct mistakes, something they wouldn't be able to do in a very intensely timed exam where they're under very much pressure to finish and there's no time to correct mistakes. So those were two of the strong ways in which we could see that people were starting to think about the learning aspects of exams and assessment, not just about the measurement, although they were concerned about preventing cheating, and quite a lot of use of the plagiarism detection software was mentioned, Turnitin, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was found to be useful, but as Linda also said in the keynote, the proctoring software wasn't popular with the program directors and the proprietary software, not just because it was a lot of work, but because they just didn't think it was helpful. And of course, they did say that rewriting these exam questions was very time consuming. Especially if they had several modules on a program and every single module had to have new questions written and then sent to the body to agree them to a QA, through a QA process. So that was very time consuming, rewriting the questions. I'm presuming that now they did it last year in 2020, perhaps they won't be having to do that again this year, but I'm not sure. Maybe some of you involved can let us know about that. So just to summarize really some of these program directors' views that we got out of this study, really looking at what was going on, they are very much mostly going to stick with exams. There were two programs that used coursework. One had used coursework before the pandemic and one switched to coursework only during the pandemic last year, which is quite interesting. I mean, they had been thinking about it and they just brought it forward. So, but mostly it was still exams, but the exams were very much about open book exams and the idea of redesigning the questions to discourage plagiarism, but also means the students have to do more thinking and learning. There were actually two of the programs who did actually, program leaders did say, this was in the interviews last September, that they would like to go back to the the exam centres and the invigilated in-person exams. I don't know whether they're still of that view, but they were some of the larger undergraduate programmes did feel that that was the best option, and they would like to return to it. But it doesn't look like that's happening this year. So, and who knows in the future whether there will ever be that return to exam centres. So we can see that there's the rethinking of assessment pedagogy to think about more use of coursework. So even though some of them didn't include more coursework, they did start thinking about adding coursework as well as exams, having a mix of coursework and exams. And so there is this shift really from viewing assessment as measurement of learning to understanding that assessment is actually an important part of the learning process. With perhaps a range of views on future planning. And I do feel that from talking to these programme directors that the pandemic has really shifted views and has really maybe accelerated or brought forward ideas that they already had and are now that they're putting into practice. But of course, there are these issues around workload and support. Making changes to assessment is incredibly difficult. I know this from my experience. I mean, maybe it shouldn't be so difficult because we do need to update assessments. But I mean, you just think the thought of having to rewrite all the questions, you know, anyway. So we had, out of this study, Alan and I came up with several things that we think that, or rethinks we call them, that of assessment to take forward really for online assessment and for distance learning assessment, particularly not just for the University of London, but for other institutions as well. And the first one is about strengthening formative assessments and moving away from exams towards alternative assessments that provide more opportunities for learning. So assessment becomes a learning process, such as student presentations. And I think one way of thinking of this, which I think actually was very clear in the previous presentation on the assessment of performing arts, is that perhaps we should design the assessments first before designing the learning materials and teaching materials. Because if you design an assessment first and then all your teaching becomes a sort of formative assessments leading up to being able to do that summative assessment. So this sort of leads to the second point really, that summative assessment needs to have some kind of formative component, whether it's feedback on drafts, practice, preparation, and that needs to link with the teaching. So this link between assessment and pedagogy and materials and course design is very important. And then if there is an exam or an assignment, the feedback needs to be able to be used. And this is a problem, I think, with modular programs that we're all involved in is that if you have feedback from one module, can you use it for the next module? Because otherwise it's a bit of a waste of feedback. If you're telling the students what they can do to improve, but when can they do it? So it needs much more linking between the assessments across a whole program, which is something that might be quite a big ask, something to think about, working across modules. The second one I'm not going to say too much about because we've had quite a lot on this one, and this is about the cheating and plagiarism, except to perhaps be provocative and say perhaps we're being unrealistic if we think we should be able to detect and punish all cheating, because it's going to be impossible. I mean, probably cheating occurs in invigilated examination centres, and we know this. It's going to be impossible to detect everything, and the best way of doing it probably is to redesign the assessment to reduce the cheating as much as possible by educating students and having the open book assessment with application, evaluation and synthesis questions, not recall, and also educating the students themselves to detect plagiarism themselves using the software themselves before submitting coursework. So that is where energy needs to go, as well as into the detecting and punishing all cheating, and using all the software and the the software to ensure that students aren't cheating. I think it's the redesign that's more important than just inventing new technological solutions. Anyway, I think we've just got time for Alan to just say something about our last rethink from this project.
Just to say, Alan, you have 2 minutes for this one.
Thank you very much, Lynsie. So just to briefly say something else to add to what Gwyneth said about the previous slide, if you accept, and it's hard for some people to accept, if you accept that in digitally supported assessment we cannot stop all cheating, then you are driven of necessity into redesigning assessment where you know what your students are doing individually. And that takes us here into Rethink 3, which is investing in assessment, in particular for distance and online learning. And it means rethinking the economic models for creating and managing courses. Course content has always had the priority in distance and online learning. And what we're suggesting here, polemically, as Gwyneth says, is that we have to shift some of the spending priorities in course management and put more of it into the management of assessment. We need to support programme directors in redesigning their assessments. So let's just tell people that it's got to be done. Let's get them some help to do it. We also believe that if we are redesigning assessment to take place on a continuous as well as a summative basis, that we have to rethink the sorts of learning outcomes. And I thought the work that Elisabeth shared from Goldsmiths was so creative in how that issue can be approached. And to conclude, without rehearsing all of this, designing for academic integrity is our firm view, where the emphasis needs to be put rather than in technical solutions to preventing cheating. Designing for academic integrity is in our view the core way forward, and productive pedagogically as well. So I think we'll finish there, Lynsie. I hope we've met your time guidelines.
Absolutely, thank you for that, Alan. And I'm hoping that the discussion, the Q&A for this will draw out any other points that you and Gwyneth would like to bring forward. So just a reminder to our audience today, so please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the toolbar, or use the chat feature. Remember to either select all panelists or all panelists and attendees to share a little bit more across the piece. But I'll kick things off. Actually, I couldn't agree more. Actually, in terms of the especially the Rethink 3 that you finished off with, Alan. Investing in assessment is a key thing. I think for brand new programs, that's probably a little easier on the basis that you have a clean slate to try and really make sure that the program does integrate. So where Gwyneth was mentioning about modular, the tendency for us to think in modules and not have that integration across programs is quite a sad thing. Actually, I think there's much missed opportunity when we don't assess across programs and have that integrated approach. So how else do you think our colleagues might be able to, with pre-existing courses, find a way forward in a really practical sense to make things happen?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think often materials, the course materials or the teaching materials and the resources are often updated and revised every year, because it often have to be. But as well as that, I think there needs to be some process for updating and revising assessments with guidance from experts. I mean, there is the toolkit. But I think what, certainly I found when working on writing distance learning course and designing it, working with a variety of experts, some with technical expertise, some with pedagogic expertise, gives you ideas for how to enhance the course, maybe in quite small ways, in steps, if it's an existing course. So I think there needs to be a sort of teamwork approach really to assessment. Which for distance learning and for campus-based courses as well, where the team actually, all module leaders say, discuss all their assessments and work together on it. Alan, have you got any thoughts?
Well, I think perhaps just to rehearse something that we've mentioned earlier, which is that this isn't just a question for the individual program leader, because the implications are economic and financial in the way in which courses are managed. And so if there are problems about academic integrity, which university management would be rightly concerned about, and we go on, so there's a linked couple of assumptions here, and we go on to a new place once the pandemic is under control, rather than say, let's get back to where we were, and I'm sure we will go on to a new place, then we are going to have to do this. And university managers are going to have to think as to how this is going to be funded, because it will need funding.
Definitely, thank you. Again, I couldn't agree more. I think the actual, the fact that we are here to try and learn a little bit more, to try and share those experiences, is definitely a step in the right direction. We've got a question from Kalina. So when speaking about academic integrity, how do we address the disparity in HE level engagement, readiness from learners, and the level they come from college with? There is a divide in between what universities demand from students versus the practical and real life experiences they come from from school.
Well, again, I think that's a very, very pertinent question, and one that hasn't got any easy answers. Of course, you have to start with where the learners are. It's no point in giving assessments that are totally inappropriate for them, or that they aren't prepared for, because then they will just perform badly, and that will reduce motivation. So I think knowing where students start, and this is what I'm quite interested in, knowing the level the student starts at, and then working out the level they can realistically attain in a module, and looking at that progress is very important. And of course, different students start at different levels. So, but that's something we really don't take into account. We assume that all our students are all at this certain academic level, and so they can then go up here, which what the assessment is where the assessment's taking them. So considering, sort of doing some kind of evaluation of students, or maybe it can be self-evaluations of where they are at the start of the programme, and then where they need to move to, which won't be the same for all students, and then but recognising that in the assessment. That's a completely new assessment design. Alan, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yes, I'm not really able to comment on the mismatch between the skills and attitudes and experiences that students bring with them from school before university, and the clash they find with university culture, if that's what our participant asks about. But I do think her question led me to reflect more on academic on authenticity in assessment, and what sort of skills, to think more carefully about what sort of skills as well as knowledge we want students to be gaining as they go out into the world from us. And it's probably true to say, just to be provocative, that they've forgotten most of the subject knowledge within 3 to 5 years of leaving. Much though that might break our hearts as academics. But the skills that they learn are ones that they will take with them into their adult lives on a personal, social, as well as professional basis. And I think we need to be much more respectful and pay much more attention to how we support that skills and how we assess the skills that students are learning.
Thank you, Alan. I'm just conscious of the time here. So our session is supposed to finish off at 4. It's 59, and I'm sure colleagues may want to have a break for those who do before the closing keynote. So Alan, Gwyneth and Elisabeth, I don't know if you need to grab a cup of coffee, but we do have a few questions in the Q&A section that we could either answer live here, or perhaps type an answer thereafter and follow up. I'm flexible, but to the rest of our attendees, please feel free to stay on with us, or go and grab that quick cup of coffee or tea just before the 1/4 session. But I'd definitely like to thank Elisabeth, Alan and Gwyneth. Thank you very much for your experiences and and sharing the valuable sort of lessons learned and new fresh ideas actually for a lot of our colleagues. I think it's been a really fruitful session, so thank you.
Maybe I'll try and see if I can type in a few answers, but I think probably most people are going to leave because we all need our breaks.
I'm afraid you won't be able to type any answers in once the webinar finishes. So you might want to give a very truncated answer now, because once I end this session, I'm afraid people will not be able to type any responses.
Oh, Andrew, you hold all the power. Okay.
Well, I mean, I think I just agree with the comments from Alan that you know, the time for assessment design, and that this is a really big issue that needs to be addressed. And you know, again, we're addressing and preparing for the real world in assessments. There's a final question about online timed assessments really viable if we don't have proctoring. Well, I think we've sort of talked about that with the open book exams. I think there's a whole more big debate to have about what an open book exam is, what it means, what about the timing. I think there's still a huge lot to discuss, and that's why we've run out of time. But thank you everybody for your questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll let everyone go for their call.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.